Welcome back to the Forensics Detailing channel. Now, if you love detailing, you're probably very proficient. Take a lot of time to clean your car, wax your car, dress your tyres, clean the interior, all these things we've talked about. But to unlock the full operational power of this Death Star, or detailing even, sorry, at some point you have to take the step into the machine polishing world. In this video, we're going to be delving into that and showing you 3 machine application abrasives from Soft99 that are going to allow you to do lots of cool things to the finish of your car. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Great to see you. Don't forget to subscribe. So today we're talking about the wonderful world of machine polishing, and in particular these 3 abrasives from Soft99. So we have their cutting compound, their polishing compound, and their finishing compound. What is the difference and what are they for? Well, there's quite a lot of ground to cover, so let's just take a step back a little bit. Now, the biggest, coolest thing about detailing, I think, one of them is learning to machine polish your car, because it can have a radical difference to the paintwork, especially when it's all dull, especially when it's all covered in swirls. You can make a massive difference to your paint. Before you attempt to machine polish your car, I think you should be proficient at detailing, and you should dabble and learn how to kind of clean your car well, maintain it well, wash it well, wash it safely, learn about decontamination, because that is critical. And then once you've kind of got to grips with those 2 things, you can then go on and machine polish, I think. Now, if you don't wash your car properly prior to machine polishing and there's dirt all around the edges, the panels have still got patches of dirt on them, you're using dirty equipment, you can actually scratch your paintwork while you're trying to polish it, which isn't good. So step 1, the thorough washing of your car is very, very important. Take the time with brushes to go through all the crevices. If in doubt and you're not sure what I'm talking about, watch some of the videos on this channel, but also wash your car twice. That's always a good way to do it if you're not sure. But lots of brush work is the key as well. Once it's washed, you then go on to the logical step of decontaminating. What does decontaminating mean, John? Well, if you've been following the channel, you can probably answer these questions, but it's very simple. Certain things that are on the paintwork and on the glass and other bits of your car will not come off with traditional surfactants and wash processes and soft wash mitts and soft gentle brushes. And unfortunately, they need to more aggressive chemicals and more aggressive processes to get that contamination off of the paintwork. What is contamination? Fallout, embedded iron deposits that's stuck in the clear coat, tar, adhesive, glue, bitumen, which I suppose is tar, paint, overspray. Sometimes contamination can be bug guts that you have to sort of get off, that won't come off through washing and stuff like that. How do you remove contamination? Well, the most obvious common way of doing it is to clay the surface of your vehicle. But there are other chemicals which can make the decontamination process much more easier. For example, a good tar and glue remover. If you're going around claying the car and you notice a film of yellow on every surface, well then you can make your life easier by doing a tar and glue panel wipe down type thing before you clay, because it will get a lot of it off. If you spray your paintwork with fallout and it lights up purple after you've washed it, then you've got a lot of embedded fallout in the paint. By making it light up purple, you're shrinking it and then making the claying process perhaps easier, and you will hopefully pull more clay off. So there's some examples of chemical decontamination and physical decontamination. If you don't do step 1, the wash properly, step 2 and step 3, the polishing's not going to be good. If you don't do the decontamination step properly and you go straight into polishing, you're going to be polishing into that contamination. Some of it you'll strip off with the polishing process, some of it you won't. For example, a lump of tar, or tree sap on your car could be as thick and as deep as like 500 microns, and when you're polishing, you're only going to remove the odd micron of clear coat. So it might just, you'll be polishing over a bump of contamination, and you'll see like a little Halley's Comet star mark of the polishing oil hitting it. So some of the contamination, though, you will pull off into the pad, and you're going to rub it over the surface, which could increase machine marring or grip marring, and it will stop you getting to the paintwork to polish it. And you're going to be left with contamination after the polishing process. The whole object of this game with cars is to get your paintwork looking good, and then put some protection or wax or sealant or ceramic, whatever you want, on top, and then keep your paintwork really nice and free of contamination, so your paintwork always feels quite good after you washed it. That's the name of the game, and you can feel, you know, once you've done that full prep and polishing on your car, your paintwork looks lovely and feels lovely, and then try and keep it that way. Minimise the amount of contamination on there, then you'll minimise the amount of claying you have to do, and the subsequent machine polishing you have to do to remove the clay marring and any swirls from the wash process. You get the idea. There's a little introduction to what machine polishing is all about for you. Now we're going to move on to how you go about it. Okay, so we're on to the machine polishing now, guys. So we have three main abrasive tools in this process, and these three tools should cover us for every scenario of machine polishing that we might be faced with. What are you talking about, John? Let me explain, guys. Well, first of all, we're going to start with the cutting compound. Now, the cutting compound will remove the most material, typically clear coat on modern automotive cars, which is good for defect removal. So taking away swirls and deeper swirls, or sanding marks from cars. What are sanding marks? Well, when you have paintwork refinished, it often gets wet sanded or sanded to remove texture and peel, and sometimes defects in the sanding process. So the panel can get sanded, and then those sanding marks need to be cut out. If you try to cut out sanding marks with finer grade products, you'd gloss up the matted paint, if you like, but you would find that the sanding lines are still in there, so you have to go deeper. So you'll use a more aggressive product to make the removal of sanding marks more effective. So that's your cutting compound. When should you use a cutting compound at home? When you're dealing with paintwork that has generations of heavy swirling, and you do a set, for example, with a medium polish or lower finishing polish, and it's still covered in swirls that are not machine induced from you doing it, which is another thing we'll talk about later on. So in other words, you need more cut to get those swirls out. That can happen on harder German paints that are on older cars, typically, and then using that heavy cutting compound is the best way to go. The downside, or the compromise with a heavy cutting compound, is that the finish is not as good. The risk of machine marring is much higher. The risk of hologramming with rotary application in particular is a lot higher. What's hologramming? Hologramming is when you cut, typically with a rotary polisher, and it introduces too much heat, overheats the paintwork, stresses the paintwork, and causes this defect in it that presents in certain lights as holograms, okay? Whenever you get holograms, it's not a big deal, but you need to be aware of them and finish them out because they look terrible. So that's the advantages of cutting compound, major defect removal. Disadvantages are tendency for machine marring and a lower quality of finish. As you step down to these finer products, they finish better, give you a higher gloss. They're also easier to work with because these are removing more materials. They generate more heat. They're bigger abrasives. They can be harder to buff off the panel as well. So we're covering everything you need to know here. So that's cutting compounds. Now, when you use a cutting compound, the fact it's a bigger abrasive size, it can be harder to work. So you typically use a coarser pad with bigger pores on it because you're also removing more clear coat material. If you've got a soft pad, you're going to clog up the surface with that excess material. So you tend to use a coarser pad. A coarser pad is also stiffer and it allows you to pressure in a little bit more, which can be really useful if you're doing rotary stuff. So mating your abrasive compound, cutting compound up to the right suitable cutting pad is important. This product from Soft99 will work with foam cutting pads, microfiber cutting pads, and indeed wool cutting pads, which are very good for fast cutting, less heat, and just a smoother kind of experience. Is that everything on cutting? I think it is. Let's move on to mid-range polishing. Now, when you're not taking out sanding marks, perhaps you've just got less swirls, perhaps you just have one opportunity to work to do one set on your particular vehicle because there isn't enough time to do multiple sets of polishing, then a mid-range product is also the way to go. Sometimes with very soft clear coats as well, then using a heavy cutting compound might be overkill. So you have a mid-range polish that can generally do a bit of everything. It's a jack of all trades, if you like, but it's perhaps not the master of all of the trades. Jack of all trades, master of none. It doesn't yield the maximum cut. The cutting compound does that. It doesn't yield the maximum finish necessarily because the finishing product does that, but it does a bit of both. Can you two-stage with this? Can you cut with your polishing compound and finish out again with your finishing polish? Absolutely. It's not just for single stage. You can use it however you want. So you get the idea. You might even take out sanding marks with this if they're finer 3000 grit, for example. Then we have the finishing polish. Now this is really, whenever you hear that word finishing in a machine polishing context, that is all about delivering your final finish before you go ahead and protect the paint. That could be the removing of holograms. It could be the removing of machine-induced marring from an aggressive cutting stage. It could also be the removing of hazing from the cutting stage. This is all about making your paintwork dripping wet and kind of electric and popping. And you're looking for the clarity of reflection. These are generally the easiest to wipe off the panel. The disadvantage is they're not really going to dig out swirls, only the very fine stuff that's machine induced. So you get the idea. Sometimes this can be the most suitable product to use as a single option if the paintwork isn't full of defects and you just want to gloss it up. So you're going to remove less material than either of these products, but in particular the cutting compound, okay? The most typical way to use your finishing product is in combination with a heavy cutting product like this. This will give you the maximum amount of cut that you can get for one set, and then this will finish out the product to the desired finish. So a cut and finish is a real traditional way of doing it, okay? And that's probably the most efficient way for lots of scenarios of machine polishing. Okay, that's explaining what the abrasives do. Now I want to move on to some of the other tools and how these products compare when we put them under the goniometer, which is a device which shines light on the surface and measures the reflected light to give us some readings on things like gloss, haze, image quality, RIC, and we'll keep it at that for the time being. So let's move on to the next section. So next up, guys, how do you go about using these on your machine of choice? What do you mean machine of choice, John? There's more than one? Yes, typically there are 3 types of machine polisher. You have this one here, which is the much maligned rotary polisher, if you like. Spins the pad in a circle and you can overheat the paintwork with it. It can sling, and because it's driven, it can pull you around a little bit in certain circumstances, but it's a great tool. Less and less people are using these because it's just a more comfortable ride using other forms of polishers typically, especially when you're starting out, but they can all get you to the same place. The next type of polisher is your free spinning dual action polisher, okay? So you can see the plate is mounted in a free spinning bearing. It's offset in the main axle, which creates this dual action. Obviously, the spin can be stopped or can stall when you go through concave or convex areas, or when you hit swage lines and stuff like that. You also get a slight lifting of the pad around the edge. So sometimes the disadvantage of this machine is that stall can affect your performance. and the lifting can mean that it's harder to edge with these. They like to be kept flat, and they work best on flat parts of the car. So often you'll see detailers have smaller mini tools for doing the tighter areas, but you can essentially polish most of your car with this. And there is, of course, if you've been around detailing for a while, another form of dual action polisher, which is the forced rotation dual action polisher. So it's very similar to this, except it runs around a track which creates drive to the rotation. So I can't spin this. So effectively this is going like this. I like this machine because you can't stall it out, and I find you can polish right up to the edges with it, and it's just great. But the disadvantage is, because it's driven, it can pull you a little bit more, but I don't find that much of a problem. I also really like cordless tools, I just do. So that's your 3 different types of machine polishers, guys, and most people will be using free spinning dual action polishers. Okay, how do you go about using them? Well, let's start with a cutting set, for example. First of all, you put your cutting pad onto the machine. Your pad will be bone dry with no product. You can prime your pad by putting 4 blobs down on a normal 5-inch pad, or even 5, relatively small blobs, and then you can just dab that around the panel and just work it for a second so that your pad gets a chance to warm up and you get a chance to get polish all over your pad. That can be a good idea. Always, when you're starting, work in a shoulder width or 2x2 section, and that just makes it more manageable, and you can inspect that section better. You can cover that section. If you try and do half a bonnet in one go, for example, the quality of what you're doing goes down quite rapidly. Sometimes you have to do that because there's time constraints, but you know, the more diligent and the smaller areas you can cover, the better of a job you're going to do when you're starting out. So once you've primed your pad, you've covered a little working section in 2x2 by a thin film of polish on speed 1, you crank up your machine to a working speed. What's a working speed? Well, typically I don't put them on top whack or full speed, if you like, because you can you'll generate more heat, you'll dry out the compound quicker, you've got more chance of kind of slinging stuff when it's on top speed. You just want to back it down from top speed so that the machine isn't stalling when you're working it with moderate hand pressure over a kind of flat panel. If it's stalling when you're doing that, speed it up to the point where it isn't stalling. Don't worry about stall too much. You will see it when you move, but you don't want it to be stalling all the time when it's just sat on a flat panel, okay? So build up till it's spinning nicely. Then, as a rule of thumb, you could do 4 passes. So a pass could be working like this over horizontal lines, and then working like this is another pass in vertical lines, and then another pass going back to the horizontal lines, and then another pass going back to the vertical lines. 4 passes is a good finger in the wind amount for a compound, okay? It's a good finger in the wind amount. It will vary depending on your machine speed, depending on your pressure, depending on how much compound you use, depending on what pad you use. There's a lot of variables depending on how hot it is. You know, if it's a very hot day, that can dry your compound out quicker. What are the variables you should look at to know if you're polishing, your set is too long or too short? Okay, if you're polishing too long, you'll see the compound dry out on the panel, and you might be dry buffing sections as you go over that polish, or you might see it dusting up. If that's happening, for some reason, you've got to manage that. You don't want to be polishing when it's all dusting and dry. You don't want to be dry buffing. So it's always working a nice oily film. Could you go on beyond 4 sets if the film's oily? Yes, you can, and sometimes I do. Sometimes you could do 5 or 6. But with most polishes, you get what's called the breakdown. So it starts off quite opaque and white, and as you work it, it becomes a little bit more see-through, a little bit more oily, and that's called the breakdown. And when that breakdown happens, you're starting to get diminishing returns. You must also remember, with cutting compounds, the more you work them, the more debris or clear coat you're pulling off into the pad. So 4 passes is a good starting point. Somewhere between 4 to 6, no more, and that is what you call a set, okay? So that's your cutting. Is there any differences? Well, let's just carry on. Once you've done your cutting set, you then want to wipe off the polishing paste with a clean microfiber cloth. Clean one, not some greasy one that's been sat in your glove box for like the last 6 years. You know, that some people have that dirty microfiber. Clean. So get a nice pile of good quality microfiber towels that you look after. Keep them clean. Use them a few times for the polish and then move on to the next towel, etc. I go through loads of cloth, it's a personal thing. Once you've removed that polish, you can then take a good high-powered inspection torch like this one here and have a look at the paintwork. Now, if you're a perfectionist, you can then even use a panel wipe, you know, this is rubbing alcohol, as my American brethren call it, or IPA and water, as we call it over here. And you can use that to degrease the panel so that you get a better indication of what it looks like without all the polishing oils providing masking, okay? That would be for very high level detailing because that's going to slow you down a little bit to do these inspection wipes, but you might want to do it on your first test set where you're really establishing if your process is working. Okay, so that is a set. Once you finish your set, it's very important, especially with cutting compounds, that you clean your pad. So I have a pad cleaning brush and I'll simply just take my polisher, fire it up and then work the brush over the surface and you'll see all this polish freeing up and coming off of the pad, just so the pad is clean. If you don't do that, the surface of this pad forms this cakey kind of film of polish and debris, clear coat. And that affects how well you polish and it can introduce more marring. The polish on the surface of the pad, do not let it dry because it will dry into the pad and it sets like plaster of Paris a little bit and then it's harder to remove. So don't let it dry. Once you've done about 5 or 6 sets on a pad, or actually probably more, 10 to 20 sets of using it, cleaning it, it's a good idea to swap pads. So you could rip this pad off, put it in a little bucket of clean water to soak so it doesn't dry, and then switch to a fresh pad. By doing so, also keeps the pad temperatures down. The foam in these pads heats up as you're working them. All that energy from the machine going through it, they get hot and soft. And when they get hot, you can deteriorate and damage the pad quicker. So swapping them often is good. A good amount of pads to have, for example, would be 4 to do a reasonably small car. Some guys might have a lot more. I know for a fact some guys would definitely have a lot less. So there you go. That is the basics. Now, with polishing and finishing, it's essentially the same thing, especially with this mid-range polishing on this particular mid-range pad. The only thing I'd say is with using the finishing polish, you might perhaps want to use a smaller amount. So where you're using kind of like bean-sized blobs on here, or, you know, those big peas, what they call broad beans, or kidney bean size, on here you'd be using round pea sizes and 4 of them. You'll notice when you use the finishing polish, it buffs off the panel a lot easier. It's so much smoother because it's finer, and it's much easier just doing a finish on a car and glossing it up and quickly buffing it. It's much more of a smooth process. When you introduce the cutting, you have to manage the abrasive more because it's coarser. And that leads me on to the next point, that I think it's really handy to have some masking tape when you're using these 3 products from Soft99 to mask up areas that you don't want to get polish on, or you don't want to potentially bump with the machine polisher. The classic example is all the rubber trims around the glass and you know, the door handle, you might want to mask that up, little side lights and things like that. So low-tack tape is also really important. Now, another very cool feature with all 3 of these Soft99 abrasives is they are all water miscible. So what do I mean? So it's not a pure solvent-based product that rejects water. Why is that handy? Because when you go to clean your pads, guys, the water will break down the compound and it just melts it and it flushes out your pad. Indeed, this is a pad that I've used the product on and it just flushed out. So some products won't break down and flush out all in one products won't, because they've got wax in them and you see it all stay in the pad. These, you can get your pads back to clean so that when you go to use them next time, you're dealing with a fresh pad. That's quite important. That's really nice as well. You do not want a product where the pads are hard to clean. Yeah, you just don't. Okay, so we've talked about method of doing these sets, whether it's cutting, polishing or finishing. I want to show you the data behind us and how what that means in terms of how these products actually perform. Okay, so let's just look at the results then, guys. So about 2 or 3 years ago, this car was detailed and ceramic coated and polished and refined. So we had 82.9 gloss, 7 haze and 76.1 R spec. We're really just interested in gloss and haze. We'll just cut to the chase, really. Now, after we've gone over and done a cutting set on the car, we've actually lowered the gloss down by 2 units and introduced loads of haze. John, shock horror, is that normal? Yes, because this isn't the product you finish with. This is a product you use to remove defects. So it's all about the cut and it's not about the finish. This would have been higher immediately after the car was detailed, but it's probably dropped over the next 2 to 3 years. So really what we've done here is we've taken away loads of swirls, but given us a finish that needs to be refined, ideally with this product here, as we've talked about. I'm messing around with the focus there, aren't I? So let me come back a little bit. So next up is the polish compound, which has done a good job of increasing gloss, reducing haze, and removing defects all at the same time. So if you're pushed for time and you've only got enough time to do one set of polishing all over the car, which is often a reality actually, then you are going to be using the polishing compound, no doubt about it. And the thing that I find really interesting is the difference in finish really between that and the finishing polish is only a couple of units. So that's quite a fine polish, this as well. Interesting. So the finishing polish has delivered the highest gloss. The haze reading isn't the lowest, but that could just be because it's this is a 4 reading average as well. So it could just be one of the readings hit a patch, you know, that threw the results up a little bit. Or it could be that it needed more cutting, perhaps, for this to be really efficient at lowering the haze. But anyway, that's just, you know, we won't worry about that. And over here, I thought it'd be really useful to refine the section that I'd cut with the finish. So it's had a cut and finish. And that shows you that you get the ultimate kind of results if you cut and finish. But the downside is you've got to do everything twice. So we got the car up to 89.3, 4.1. The R spec is really close to the gloss. So we're still, the cut and finish, really, that process is getting you closer to the maximum that you're going to be able to achieve in 2 sets of polishing on any car, really. There is a big caveat. You also learn, whenever you work on a car you haven't polished before, you learn about the paint. And unfortunately for me, I've learned that this paint is very, very soft. And it's going to be hard to finish this car out. It's going to require diligence. Funnily enough, when you polish onto the wings, it's great. So the wings are probably a different painter, a different paint job than the bonnet. The bonnet is fiddly paint. And that's one of the natures of doing all of this, guys. So there is, you know, there is some experience that will help you make decisions about how best to proceed. But there's nothing for you to be scared of. At some point, if you're into detailing and into cars, you are going to want to make the jump up to someone that just cleans them, to someone that just polishes them. And when you do, your first polish on the car, you're not going to know everything and you're not going to be able to necessarily solve the problems you might encounter straight away. But you can counter that by just doing a really good job with some basic knowledge and sticking to your process and doing the same thing making sure you inspect after every set. If something goes wrong, you want to spot it as soon as possible. What can go wrong when you're machine polishing? You can get some grit in your pad, and if you're not inspecting, you could go around and put, you know, pigtails in the whole car, you know, which is not easy. Well, it can be easy to do. So what else can go wrong? You can burn through the clear coat. Don't be scared by that word, burn through the clear coat. You're typically not going to do it on a dual action polisher. But if you're using a rotary, you want to be very careful of raised edges and things like that, and polishing with pressure over raised edges, especially when you're using cutting compounds. So there we go, guys. Hopefully that has been a really useful introduction to the Soft99 abrasive products. These are very handy tools that you should have in your arsenal. You don't have to use the exact pads I'm using. These are just examples. You don't have to use the same polishers that I'm using. They're just examples. But the main thing is you understand what those different products do and how you go about using them. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Take care, and I shall see you soon on the Forensics Detailing channel. Do not forget to subscribe. Oh yeah, final flyby. Doug.
Holding on to what I knew, but the moment's gone. Where was I?